All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence event series brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University, Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis, and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a panel of distinguished experts providing ongoing analysis on the attack of Ukraine. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MS in Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Dr. Michael Ard.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone to our program. Today, we'll focus on the following areas in looking at the war in Ukraine: the political, military, and intelligence situation, the impact on the environment in the war zone and beyond, and the war's impact on energy and international markets. Now, let me introduce our guests. Elizabeth Hassami is a faculty lecturer of international environmental law and policy for the Johns Hopkins University Advanced Academic Programs, and is a noted expert on environmental issues and the armed conflict in Afghanistan. She also is a founding member of the Environmental Peace Building Association. Craig Hart is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins Energy Policy and Climate Program here in Washington, D.C. Craig serves as executive director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at Pace University and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. Ron Marks is a 38-year veteran of the U.S. national security community in his lengthy CIA career. Ron was a clandestine service officer, a special assistant to the ADCIA for military affairs, and a Senate liaison for 5 directors of the CIA. Today, my co-host is Stephen Grenier, the program director of the Global Security Studies program here at Johns Hopkins Advanced Academic Programs. As a career active duty U.S. Army Special Forces officer, he worked in 32 countries and completed 11 combat tours. Now, audience, welcome, and we welcome your questions too. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them in the second half of our program. Thank you. Now let's get started. Steve, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome everyone to this, what I think will be an exciting panel. Many of the concerns expressed by these panelists a month ago have unfortunately materialized, beginning with some of the environmental issues, the conflict, the war, as well as the subsequent international sanctions against Russia has exacerbated food scarcity. The rising and shortage of fertilizer is prompting farmers and ranchers to put less fertilizer on their grazing areas or fields, which is going to result in lower crop yields with the upcoming season. This, coupled with ongoing natural disasters such as the extreme floods in China, which is going to reduce their annual wheat crop by 1/3, and the ongoing droughts in Brazil, which is going to significantly diminish the soybean crop, is resulted in a much larger, a growing number of malnourished as well as underfed individuals, especially in Africa and the Middle East. Shifting to energy, we're starting to get a better idea of the short and midterm effects of this war on energy markets. While Russia's 2008 invasion of Georgia and the 2014 annexation of Crimea prompted some discussions in European capitals about potential energy sources, it's become pretty clear that this isn't like those conflicts. This is going to prompt some really hard and difficult discussions, not only in Europe, but beyond. And it's not only limited to the international arena, it's going to cause some potential domestic political upheaval as heads of state and governments try to balance energy supplies as well as maintaining some of their environmental and clean energy goals. And then lastly, moving to the Paul Mill, the political military, as well as the intel. A month later, and we still don't really have a good idea about what is the extent of Ukraine's military losses. We're starting to get a better idea of Russian losses, and it continuously surprises many of us to see Russia's inability to conduct somewhat coherent or somewhat even limited successful attacks, and their repositioning of forces more to Eastern Ukraine, I think, is a pretty good result of that. What we're also seeing, as expected, Russian troops are beginning or are continuing to target civilians. Now, this is either as a matter of policy, artillery strikes, airstrikes, etc., or as a result of undisciplined conscript troops, or it's probably a combination of both. But this is really a dark, although expected, turn in the conflict. And so we're going to address many of these themes as well as others. And so at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Asami, who is going to kick us off with her presentation.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Let's see. Oops. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, let's get over here. Okay. Okay. Now, can everyone see? Just to make sure everyone can see the slides. Okay, great. So I want to, before I get started, just say that I am going to be touching on some sensitive topics. So if you have any issues with hearing about animal cruelty, obviously civilian casualties, things like that, this might not be the section for you, but I'm not going to have any gruesome pictures. I find them just too much. So anyhow, let me get started. So this is an update to my previous discussion on the environmental damage to this conflict, aspect of this conflict. And I think that what we're starting to see is that there is a definite targeting of the environment in this conflict that is really quite unprecedented, in my opinion. And it's posing, tremendous risk to food, water, energy security in the Ukraine and beyond due to the repercussions of what's happening. I want to say at the outset, it's impossible for me to give exact environmental impacts, costs of damages, that kind of thing. There's just not that kind of data yet. But this, in my opinion, I agree with this statement that this is ecocide in its most brutal form. And that is a statement from a report from the government of Ukraine. It's a record of environmental damage inflicted by Russian aggression. And I think at the end, I have maybe a link to that. So, I'm a visiting attorney with the Environmental Peace Building Association. We have put out an open letter on this situation and feel that it's, and I feel, and this is in the open letter as well, it's an aggressive invasion of their country in clear violation of international law. So the targeting of Ukraine's environment, one organization I'll refer to a bit is Eco Action in Ukraine. They're an NGO, and they have documented 110 environmental crimes at least. I mean, this is just the beginning. We don't even know the half of it yet, I don't think. But so these are some of the preliminary reports coming out on fossil fuel infrastructure: 36 attacks, 29 attacks on electricity stations, 7 attacks on water supplies, direct attacks on the water supply of people, and 6 attacks on nuclear facilities. That is appalling, in my opinion. And it's a violation. Here is a quote from the government of Ukraine's Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources. It's a violation of all existing norms of international law on natural protection, sustainable development, humanitarian law, and just basic norms of morality and principles of human coexistence. And I think that kind of says it all. It's really quite horrifying. And really, the natural heritage of Ukraine is currently being destroyed. And here's just a list of what's happening. Oil, chemical, and gas facilities are being directly targeted. Nuclear power plants targeted with artillery fire. I think that's a first, as far as I know, in combat, that you're actually targeting nuclear power plants. Tremendous GHGs are being emitted from these bombings and explosions. One of the most disturbing aspects of this to me are that the wildlife refuges and zoos are being directly targeted, which is horrific. 20 nature reserves and national parks have been bombed, really for no reason. 44% of the most vulnerable environmental areas are in active war zones currently. 200 territories in what's known as the Emerald Network, which is an ecological network, are being targeted. And then there have been attacks on chemical plants. There's one directly on this chemical plant. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I will probably mispronounce that, but leaked tremendous amounts of ammonia. And the Russian military is using sites protected under the Ramsar Convention, which protects wetlands, for staging areas, which is, these are areas that are not to be touched. We're migrating fowl, use as, areas to stop in on their migration patterns. And so it's really disrupting not only the environment, the animals, obviously not only civilians, but the environment, migrating animals, local flocks of waterfowl, and just tremendous damage already that we're seeing. So this is a map of environmental crimes according to EcoAction as well. You can see there have been tremendous recorded and verified crimes already. So I just wanted to touch on quickly the legal accountability of Russian military forces. And so domestic accountability, Ukraine includes ecocide in their domestic legislation. That's Article 441 of its criminal code. Under international accountability, of course, this is much more difficult, but there is the possibility of prosecution under Article 8 of the ICC International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. And it has jurisdiction over the crimes of intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause and this is really key, widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. And I just have a little link there to the Conflict and Environment Observatory, or CEOBS, which has tremendous resources. If you're interested in this topic, you can go to ceobs.org and read all the reports. It's a great site. So I want to turn just for a second to refugees and IDPs, internally displaced persons, which is another aspect of this horrifying conflict. As of, let's see, 2 days ago, the tally for refugees fleeing the country was 4,244,000, with an additional 10 to 13 million trying to leave or who are displaced internally within Ukraine. Family separation is a significant concern as men are being asked to stay, and I believe are. So it's generally speaking women and children fleeing, but there's special concerns about elderly and people with disabilities who are trapped in areas that are extremely dangerous. 4 million children, over half of all children in Ukraine, have been uprooted by this conflict. And these statistics are all from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. So this is just a map of the refugee and IDP situation from UNHCR, and where you can see where the primary migration is at this point is Poland, and then lesser degrees to Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and then some back into Russia. And of course, I think we've all heard about the forced migration of people being sent to Russia forcibly, which is something I've never heard of before. Horrible. And I want to turn now to global food security, because this is a huge issue, not just for Ukraine, but for everyone. So Ukraine is the second largest grain supplier and the largest sunflower oil supplier in the world. Together, Russia and Ukraine exported 25% of the world's wheat in 2019. So the conflict will definitely impact global food security, there's no question, and particularly from the Middle East and Africa and vulnerable nations. Now, we all remember, or if we're old enough to remember, you remember the Arab Spring, which had links to the rise in grain prices. So price of bread rising rapidly in the Middle East can possibly lead to violent protests and political upheaval. It's happened before, and so we have to wait and see what's going to happen. Agricultural equipment, grain silos, and warehouses in Ukraine have been targeted directly and destroyed by Russian military. One warehouse, which had hundreds of thousands of pounds of frozen foods, was bombed. So it's really distressing, not only just for the people internally to Ukraine, but for really everybody. So I wanted to look at the environmental impact of bombings. Just one bomb can leave obviously a large crater in the earth, human casualties and wildlife killed. The spread of fire destroys landscape and causes the release of heavy metals and toxic chemicals, which disperse through the landscape, water, atmosphere. So then you have groundwater and air all contaminated by toxins. And thousands of bombs are being dropped on one of the most heavily industrialized nations on earth, with significant chemical factories and things like that. So it's a terrible situation. I wanted to do just a quick update on Chernobyl, because this morning I read the most recent report on, so Russia's military has withdrawn from the area around Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and they looted on their way out. They claimed that their military, the radiation exposure the Ukrainian government says that the Russia withdrew because of military losses and radiation exposure of their troops. Now, what's really concerning is there's forest fires in the area around the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So that's the CEZ, because of conflict, which is allowing radioactive material to enter the atmosphere. And the fires are increasing. And as the temperatures warm, there's a lot of concern that this is going to get worse and worse. And that's just a picture there of Chernobyl with Russian tanks. So one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of this conflict for me, and I think for anyone who loves animals or their pets, is the impact on animals. And one thing that I've read is that it almost seems, as you see pictures here of Ukrainian refugees leaving with their pets, that the Russian military is almost purposefully targeting zoos, shelters, horse stables, to just sort of morally wound Ukrainians. It's really horrific. The Russians left behind bullet-riddled corpses of cows, horses, goats, pet dogs in their carriers, just beyond the pale. And this is a quote. There was a great article in the Atlantic this week called "All Creatures Great and Small," but there's a quote: "Something is uniquely unfair about the suffering that war inflicts on animals. They are the ultimate non-combatants." And I think that's very true. An environmental catastrophe is unfolding that will last long after the final Russian troops leave the country and could harm Ukrainian communities for years to come. That's a quote from Evgenia Zasidako. And her worst fear is that the damage will be so huge that we won't be able to rebuild, she said. I just wanted to give a little more info. So there's a great report, which is the record, if you're interested in this, the record of environmental damage inflicted by Russian aggression in Ukraine. That's from their Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources. And that's the link there right below it. Our organization, the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, we have updates bi-weekly that you can subscribe to, that I myself contribute to every report that comes out. We try to upload what we pick through them and upload the most salient pieces of information, reports, news items on armed conflict in the environment. And then of course, CEOPS, I think, is a great resource for anyone who's interested. And so that's my presentation. I just wanted to highlight that I think one of the hallmarks of this conflict, kind of like if those who are old enough remember the Bosnian conflict, the targeting of women through the rape hotels was a unique conflict, hallmark of that conflict. And I feel like the targeting of the environment in this conflict is quite unique. It is, I mean, I would say Chechnya, you saw a lot of it as well, but this is horrific to see. So there we go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Asami. Professor Hart.
Good. So I'll be speaking about energy issues as well as sanctions, and I think those are closely intertwined, particularly because the Russian economy is so dependent upon oil and gas revenues in any given year. State revenues, that sector can account for over 50% of state revenues. And right now, given that as this conflict proceeds and Russia is increasingly cut off from the world, the one thing it has to offer that the world might be interested in buying or might be forced to buy even under the worst of circumstances is oil and gas from them. And indeed, what we're seeing is that even though there are efforts to prevent these sales, that sales still do happen. They're happening under duress conditions, under unusual conditions, which probably means that they're selling less, and it obviously means they're getting lesser of a price. And we've seen some of this has been that companies and countries are willing to purchase these commodities if they get a lower price, even if it means taking a hit reputationally. So there's still issues there with Western companies, and of course, in order to really make sanctions effective, it's critical that Chinese companies, which are going to be invariably state-owned companies and therefore an instrument of Chinese state policy, be involved and completely in alliance with Western sanctions. And of course, that's not happening. That's clearly not the position of the Chinese government. And even though they may be willing to take certain steps that would appear to be somewhat face-saving or window dressing, to appear to be going along with the global community, they still are very clearly signaling that there's no limits. I think the terminology is there's no limits to cooperation between China and Russia. You just obviously cannot be sending those mixed signals and expect that we're going to be able to rely on China in presenting a unified front that'll allow sanctions to really bite. Now, having said that, what does really bite mean? Because the sanctions that have been in place for many years, have been damaging to the Russian economy. The sanctions that have been imposed now on as a result of this most recent invasion have further damaged the economy, and it's going to have very clearly long-term effects. And the sanctions that are to come are going to have, be potentially even greater and worse. So there's no question that the sanctions are going to be damaging and costly to Russia. I think the difficult part here is, there's two aspects of it. Is one, where do we stop, or where does the collection of countries stop? And what impact do we think it might actually have? And I'm going to take the latter one first. The impact that it might have, it probably is not going to incite a regime change. Now, that's a personal opinion, and I don't have a crystal ball. But I'm going to suggest that the Russian people have become long accustomed to these kinds of sanctions. There's been there's a sense that they've been the target of these kinds of sanctions from the West, and even at the point of collapse of the Soviet Union, there were already bread lines before the ultimate collapse, and then afterwards, when inflation set in, they had experienced that kind of hardship. And even though this was a failure of their own system, there was a degree of blame of the West for this. There was a sense that the West had inflicted this upon them, that this was punishment. And certainly since the collapse, the sanctions that have been taken by US and other governments, most definitely there's an element among public reaction that this is punishment. And so, although I know we're thinking they're going to hopefully blame their leadership and affect a change, I think that the people may have been socialized into thinking that actually this is more a time when there has to be a rallying around and a circling of the wagons. And I think, the effect is probably mixed among the population, but I think there's an element of that certainly. Because they have been inured to it. The other thing is that, to the extent that this is correctly perceived by the Russian people as punishment for one individual's decisions. I think we're probably going to find ourselves, well, I think in order to affect any change, if the hope is that this will affect change, that change is going to have to be made at the very top of the government with the security forces, particularly, not really a public outpouring on the street. I think what happened in 1991 was fairly, it was unique in a number of ways, but I don't think it's indicative of what's likely to come. Gorbachev fell not because he took a hard line. Soviet and Russian leaders don't typically find themselves being expelled from office for being hard. At least there's a margin of brutality that is accepted in these systems that Vladimir Putin has simply not even tested the limits of. If Joseph Stalin is the example, that would mean you'd have to murder 20 to 30 million of your own countrymen before you're actually even, if that's the standard that's being adopted. And Vladimir Putin is certainly not that relative to his own countrymen, or if you're just doing this on numbers. So the system doesn't really hold people accountable for taking a hard line. Gorbachev was expelled from office for being weak. Gorbachev was expelled for allowing the system itself to collapse. And so I think these sanctions are, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to accept in the West a great deal of pain ourselves in our own economies with inflation and with volatility and with shortage, in order to really inflict the kind of incentives that would be required in order to effectuate the kind of change that we're hoping might happen, or some may hope will happen. And then we have to balance that with how far do we go with, do we want to turn Russia into a failed state? And what are the implications of a Russia with nuclear weapons? And so now coming back to the energy issue, if Europe wished to stop using Russian gas and could go without it, which it cannot, that would be, an economic weapon that would be tantamount to it's the nuclear weapon of economic warfare. Now they cannot do that, but what is happening is Germany is taking some prudent steps to take control of Gazprom assets and manage those during the conflict. I don't take this to be necessarily confiscation and punishment. I take this to be more akin to what happened in World War II, where when war was finally declared between the US and Germany, that essentially it froze the status of those assets. And after the cessation of hostilities, they would be, in fact, returned to their rightful owner, depending upon, of course, who prevailed. So Germany, maybe in a sense, it's certainly a defensive move for Germany's own interests. Storage facilities and so on are going to be critical. But at the same time, once this is all done, and that may be a long time from now, the question is going to be, what do we have to do now? About the cessation of those sanctions, and how to try to develop an economic incentive system for good behavior on the part of Russia, probably taking much to heart the lessons of, again, what happened after World War I, and then what happened after World War II. And of course, the story being that severe punishment is likely to encourage further bad behavior and extreme nationalism and radicalism, whereas some kind of more forgiving stance may be, in fact, the way forward if we're going to try to integrate Russia back into an economic order that's peaceful. But the longer this goes on, the more difficult that's going to be, because this is all realigning alliances between East and West in a very ugly and adversarial way. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Hart. Professor Marks, the floor is yours.
Mute,
I think you're on mute.
mute.
Let me just do a quick summary here, because obviously we're up on the half hour here now, and unfortunately I have to leave in about 10 minutes. Let me just say a couple of things in comment here. I think from an intelligence standpoint at this point, it's been interesting to see two factors. One, the enormous availability of open source information to follow almost every aspect of this. I lived through the 1990s. I was on Capitol Hill. I lived through the Southeastern European debacle, and I was on Capitol Hill and in the intelligence community at that time, as well as outside, doing some things in the International Court of Justice, et cetera, to have the kind of evidence that we're now having from open source intelligence, from various and sundry avenues has been tremendously, I think, important, not only for the sake of having that information for the court, but also establishing the case publicly. And so that the West certainly understands. Make no mistake about it, at this point in time, Putin has control over the Russian information system. He also will have control, or has control after some reshuffling, I think, over his intelligence people, although he's still very unhappy at this point about some of their predictions going in. There's some big gaps here, and one of those gaps is and remains Putin. This is a dictatorship. This is about Tsar Vladimir, and no one is going to get inside of his head right now. And if he was cagey before, he's even more cagey now. However, any kind of move he's going to make, and I think he's starting to understand it at this point, he has to get other people to do for him. Russia's a little leaky. There's some people that are unhappy about this. Now he's tracking them down. And you're seeing efforts, certainly within Russia at this point, more than a few efforts at this point, to engage in some pretty harsh punishment for those who oppose him. Switching topics a little bit, I'm not surprised at what's happening on the border in terms of dealing, or within Ukraine itself, in terms of dealing with the locals. I've seen it in Afghanistan. Saw it again in Chechnya. Certainly saw it or an extended version of it in Syria through others, but sponsored by. I'm afraid we're going to see more of that. Again, this goes back to the war crimes issue of trying to track it and make sure that we're able to monitor it. I would also say that in terms of, again, us trying to and understand where the Chinese are going on this. That's another problem. Near as I can tell, again, there's many sources on this. Beijing is nervous about this. They're unhappy about this. On the other hand, they've kept a pretty good handle internally as well, in terms of exchanges of information among their people. They're monitoring very carefully at this point to make sure that there is at least a neutral message coming forward. I think if Xi had his way at this point, he wouldn't be anywhere near this thing. But the fact of the matter is, he's not going to be backing off anytime soon. He has his own considerations in terms of where he has to go with Taiwan in the future. So, anything he says right now will certainly be turned around against him. So, bottom line, I think from an intelligence standpoint and from an understanding standpoint, again, we have enormous amounts of information. A bit of the fog of war here right now. But again, I would point to the success not only of Americans, the American government passing information to Ukraine, but also in terms, again, of multiple sources of open source information from thousands of different people who are allowing us, I think, to track this thing much more carefully than ever before. And certainly, again, in terms of the war crimes areas, really identify those areas that need to be followed. So I'm sure there are many other questions, and like an Intel guy, I could go on forever, but let's not do that. Let's wrap it up, and then I will turn it over to your good graces. And I can hang on for a few more minutes, I'm afraid, and I need to go off, but happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Marks. Dr. Ard, I'll turn it back over to you for monitoring the questions.
All right, thank you very much. And Mark asks, Russia's invasion has led to massive international backlash. Did Russia underestimate the side effects of this invasion, or was Russia willing to gain Ukraine regardless of the cost? What do you think, Ron?
There's the old joke was that there's policy successes and intelligence failures. If Putin were being drawn in at this point, he would no doubt be rattling his ball bearings and saying something to the effect of, I didn't know. I don't think he did. I think he'd gone through, not unlike as we were talking about before, Stalin went through a series of military purges in advance of World War II, and ended up with quite a mediocre crop of people when the attacks finally, he didn't believe his own people, in fact, that Hitler was going to attack him. I think you get a little bit of that with Putin here too. This is a dictatorship problem. The guys around here were giving me optimistic estimates about 10-day worth of fighting. The Ukrainians were going to collapse like an accordion. I think he also, and here a PhD thesis will be done forever. The subject is the care and feeding of the Russian military. Very clear at this point that the terms of just the care for and otherwise supply mechanisms, the logistics of the Russian military were horrific. The tire issue is the one everybody points to. That one goes simply to where those trucks were stored. Never mind whether or not there was corruption in terms of kickback for the tires and all that kind of thing. So he really went in with what he thought was a very strong hand. He went in with a quarter, essentially, of his army. It's I was at 250, was it 300,000, 400,000, something like that. But whatever it is, that is feds. So that's nice. So he went in a good portion of his military, and he got clobbered. And I think that right now, all he's doing is he's pulled back. I think he's loading his gun. I think he's getting ready to go again, and he will use those tactics that they use quietly in Chechnya, which is he's going to use terror tactics as a way of rooting out potential guerrilla activities, as well as keeping his dominance and keeping his fingers in there. So again, long-winded way of saying, I don't think he knew. I don't think he anticipated. I think that's been a great shock to him, and I think he's scrambling to try to pick up the pieces and move ahead.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks for the Caine mutiny reference there, very subtly put in the beginning, and known probably only to a few of us here.
All good managers have a set of ball bearings somewhere.
All right, another question from Victoria. What is the perceived threat of nuclear warfare in the intelligence community? So how do we think the intel community is looking at this now as a potential threat?
Well, I think, again, I'll go back to Putin as the figurehead here. I think Putin is like every nasty teenager you've ever run into. He knows what buttons to push. He knows how far to go. And he's well aware that the nuclear, and again, I think also an expression of his frustration, he's well aware of what the nuclear statement means to people and that it gets people all upset. And I think he thought to some extent it might be a ploy to separate powers within NATO as well. And I think that was another one where it was a miscalculation, in part because I think people almost immediately were dismissive of it, how seriously we're really going to take this. And then it certainly failed. If anything, it may have galvanized a Finland or a Sweden and others who really wouldn't have considered being part of a NATO or EU before. So, again, counterproductive, but I take that as again, as a swing and a miss on his part. And just a reminder, of course, that he is still a member of a powerful country, which is still what he's all about. I mean, this is about projection of power. And that was another example of him sort of waving around his big stick, but I think to no avail. And the odds on that happening are somewhere between nil and zilch, frankly.
Okay. Another question directly to Ron Marks from Bruce. Do you think there is a lot of internal intention in the IC on whether to release so much intelligence publicly, or do you think that this is a strategy the IC has largely gotten behind?
Oh, time immemorial. In the final analysis, it is up to the President of the United States to decide what material is and is not releasable. I think people in the community sometimes forget that, and I don't blame them. Look, I was a human intelligence officer. I did analytical work. I worked on Capitol Hill. I've been on all sides of this thing. And sources of information and the methodologies by which you collect them are very sensitive. I think we were fortunate to have Avril Haines. I think we were fortunate to have Bill Burns in their positions at DNI and Director CIA. They know about the policy and they know about the intelligence end. And I think people were willing to, because of the heinous activity of all of this, I think we're willing to go much further than they have perhaps in the past. It does open up some questions, the least of which is we have other partners out there now beyond the so-called Five Eyes who may want to have an additional dip in the intel pool at some point in time as well. We're going to have to explain why we're not giving them that. My leading indicator for whether or not the intelligence community objects to anything is whether or not they have leaked to the Washington Post their discomfort and dissatisfaction. And I haven't seen a lot of that. In fact, I don't think I've seen any of that yet. So I think we seem to be striking the balance for now, again, just because Putin looks like a bad Bond villain in all of this. I think it's been fairly easy to accept.
Thank you. Okay, so another question for the panel. This is a question about attacks on infrastructure. I mean, Elizabeth spoke a lot about the attacks specifically targeting the environment, but this is about the infrastructure. How do we interpret this? Is this similarly essentially to get at the Ukrainian psychology to lower their morale? Is it for military need, simply apathy, destructiveness on the part of the Russians for its own sake, or lack of accuracy in munitions? I mean, how do we see the deliberate attack on infrastructure here?
I think if you look at Grozny and the Russian style of warfare in Chechnya, they pretty much leveled everything. If you look at the pictures, they were horrific. They left nothing standing, you know, and perhaps it was just a smaller situation that people weren't as aware of, but I don't see too much of a difference between that situation and what we're seeing in Ukraine. So they've done it before, so it's not too much of a surprise. However, they didn't have major nuclear facilities like Chernobyl or you know, other nuclear power plants that they are just indiscriminately firing on. So in some senses, I think it's far more dangerous in this situation, but I don't think it should be a surprise. It seems like a tactic that they've used.
Elizabeth, by the way, on that, are you surprised that we haven't heard more about these attacks on nuclear sites in terms of radiation leakage or scramming reactors or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see more information, and I'd like to see people a little more upset about it because it is really awful. And I think, you know, I remember Chernobyl. I was a teenager and I was in England at the time, and it, you know, it impacted people living in England very far away. So, yeah, I'm a little surprised that there's not more outrage over it. But yeah.
Next question is from Levi, and let me summarize this. Are we expecting to see U.S. putting more pressure on U.S. firms who may still be in Russia and still doing business in some way, leaving? This is an issue I initially saw. A lot of companies, of course, voluntarily left Russia. Many multinationals have, but there was some early reports that some were staying. Where do we have a sense of that, where we are on that? U.S. companies.
Say, I think for there have been some notable exceptions of companies that have chosen not to leave and to stay. Koch Industries is one, and they made the argument that, well, one, they have a significant investment there, of course, but they also made the argument, and they're a little more immune to public opinion as well because they're privately held. But they made the argument, of course, that this would be just turning over assets to Russia. I think in the long run, you know, what will need to happen is some kind of a sense of a freeze, just as did happen in World War II. Right now, once this is resolved, there may need to be discussions about how things are restored, because if they're not, you know, the long-term damage of not having access to technology, to human capital, as well as to you know, the cutting-edge companies that can raise capital and invest in Russia, even if sanctions were to stop, those companies will need to go back for the sake of Russia, if not their own well-being as well. So I take this now as being an extended conflict where there's going to need to be some thinking about how the rules apply for the period of conflict, and then thinking about how business relations proceed after that, and everyone can be in compliance.
Thanks. Another question on perhaps a sanction issue, but perhaps do we see it extending if, for example, China is not willing to cooperate? Could we anticipate EU or US sanctions on China in retaliation?
I'll take that if no one else wants to comment.
Go right
Please,
ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that will be very much problematic. Obviously, China is a critical part of the world's economy. Second largest economy in the world. Much of our supply chains in Europe and in the US are dependent upon China. Imposing sanctions for its foreign policy decisions vis-a-vis Russia would it seem to me to be not only, it would obviously be regarded extremely aggressively by the Chinese, but it also, I think everyone's thinking in the back of their minds is, how does this play out vis-a-vis Taiwan? And what are the, what are the signals here vis-a-vis China taking action on Taiwan? And I think maybe the logic of that, and I honestly, this is just pure speculation, unprepared for this particular question, but if we start to impose sanctions now, we start to also sour that relationship, and not necessarily towards Taiwan, but make China potentially more aggressive in other areas. And it means that we don't have those options if we really need them in the event China does do something themselves. I think we can punish them for their own actions. I don't know that punishing them for their relations with other countries is going to be a workable model, because I mean, if we start doing that, it's it's guilt by association in a way that that would have all kinds of ripple effects. Now, that said, there will be there will be damage inflicted on China just collaterally through these sanctions, just because this is going to cause an impact on the entire Eurasian economy. Some of that is actually going to be harmful to China, and some of that's going to be beneficial to China, because they're going to have a captive supplier of oil and gas in Russia that they are going to very clearly be the dominant counterparty in any transactions with Russia.
Right. Thank you. Mark raises the point about how the high profile that social media has played in this war, and asks, will social media play a future role in other conflicts? Do we see this as really, and Mark, I'll leave it to the panel, but Tom Friedman raised this in a column a few days ago, that in fact calling this the First World War, in the sense that it's the whole global community has been following what's going on in this war via social media and the types of communications technology we have available. Any thoughts on this? What we see as the growing role of social media in future conflicts?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh,
please.
sorry. No, Ronnie.
No, go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
Actually, I teach a module in my new environmental security course on social media, and especially fake news in warfare, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. But in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 2020 in the summer, the amount of fake videos and fake articles was so bad and difficult that, I talked to CIOPS about what they could verify and what they couldn't. And so much of it was because I was supposed to write for a major news source, a news article, and they couldn't verify many of the accusations. So it made it very, very difficult to, and this is in the environmental sphere, as far as there were accusations of using white phosphorus on forests and things like that. We couldn't verify it. So I think it really muddies the water as far as what's happening, and that's critical. And not just in the environmental sphere, but if you have fake videos going right and left, nobody really knows what's happening. So I just wanted to mention that.
Very good. Like another question for you, Elizabeth. Are there any standards in place in which greenhouse gas emitted during this war contributed to Russia's annual greenhouse gas emissions inventory reporting? Do we have a sense for that?
That's a very good question. I would have no idea how that would be done, but that's something I'll look into for sure. That's an interesting question.
Sheila asks, a coup is probably unlikely in Russia. How else could Putin be removed? Can Putin be convinced to militarily stand down and simultaneously find a way of saving face?
Well, I'll pick up on a comment that we had earlier. There are two ways that you've seen to remove Russian leadership since 1917. You don't shoot it anymore. That was the 1917 version. Let's see, 24, Lenin had a stroke. Stalin had a stroke. Khrushchev was invited to leave after he screwed up the crops and Cuba. Brezhnev dropped dead, and Andropov dropped dead. Chernenko dropped dead. Gorbachev got pushed out. Thank you very much for playing. And Yeltsin was thankfully sort of let out the door. I think he's got two options at this point. One is he falls over dead, and the second one is of someone coming to the office and saying, Vladimir Vladimirovich, the building is surrounded. You have a choice here. I don't think he goes. I really don't. I think he has done a sufficiently good job of essentially pushing out those around him who might do that. The only way I think you can do it with him, and this goes back to, I think, a comment earlier, but forgive me because this is also going to be upsetting to people. If there is a high casualty rate in Ukraine, and he is not able to contain the information around that, there are, as I understand, a number of mobile crematoriums in and around the borders in Ukraine right now, across the border. So they're doing their best to cover up the casualties right now. That kind of thing might push, again, not the oligarchs. The oligarchs are tied up with him from a monetary standpoint, but those people who are intel senior general types immediately around him, those are still the most likely ones. But I assure you right now that they are being monitored like no one's business. So you're really going to have to make the case for me that he's going to get pushed out.
Thanks. Here's a gas question. What are Europe's alternatives in terms of gas suppliers or other sources of energy? Is it even realistic to consider decoupling from Russia's supplies? Now, Craig, you alluded to this earlier, but I know that the EU countries are looking to gain alternatives now, especially. But how realistic is it to make much of a transition in the short term, even medium term?
In a 3 to 5 year period, there's a lot it can do in terms of decreasing its reliance on Russian natural gas. I can't completely replace it in that period, but it can start, significantly reducing. In the immediate term, that's really it's extremely limited. There's been talk about, I think, turning down thermostats and things like that. In other words, less energy use. And all the damage happening to infrastructure, there's been no disruption of gas flows. It's not business as usual, but it's regarded that, I think, even in the midst of war, it's too important to both sides or all concerned. That those Russia has no incentive to sabotage those pipelines. It may not be selling gas directly to the Ukraine, but they are still using those pipelines to sell to Europe. Similarly, Ukraine, I think I don't know what the Ukrainian view on this is. They do earn revenues for transit But that right now wouldn't be a foremost in priorities. But they also may know that that may be a bridge too far. The damaging that infrastructure could, they'd be. It would be have to be a decision that would be, very carefully considered. So, right now, for the time being, they're going to try to manage continuity of business operations in the midst of this conflict. As you can imagine, that there are, and as I've indicated, there's steps being taken by Germany that are reminiscent of what happened in World War II, where businesses were no longer under direct control of their headquarters in their, home country, and that there was some kind of there was a freeze or almost a trusteeship in some way of this. And I think that in that context, the other thing that's happening is there's a bit of a negotiation going. Can Russia demand that all gas sales be made in rubles so that it creates a market for the ruble to prop up the ruble? Are any remittances going to be passing through back to Russia, and under what circumstances, through what banks, and so on? So there's right now I think a negotiation, an ongoing negotiation of these issues that force, even in the midst of a conflict, these countries that are at least the Russians or combatants are still needing to speak and maintain open lines of communication with the EU and even potentially Ukrainian counterparts as well. So this is complicated, and I don't think it's going to be entirely transparent to it's not going to be reported in the New York Times exactly what these conversations are right now in order to keep these markets operating.
Great. We have time for a few more questions, and thanks everybody for the great questions to our panelists and the lively comments in the chat about comparing the legacy of Putin with Peter the Great. Right now, it would seem to me in our scorecard that Peter the Great is looking a little better all the time. Let me get to a couple of questions. How likely is it that Poland will act unilaterally to provide direct military support to Ukraine, including sending Polish troops in support of Ukrainian forces if this conflict continues to drive Ukrainian refugees into Poland? Any sense from that? Steve, any feeling on that?
I think it's very unlikely that Poland is going to become directly involved in the conflict. They've achieved a lot of goodwill over their contributions to the NATO operations in Afghanistan, in their ability or willingness to expand their defense budgets. They have the world's attention of what they've been screaming for multiple decades and beyond about the ongoing and real threat of Russia. So I think it would be a foolish move. It could potentially divide NATO at a point where it's united more behind this effort than any other in recent memory.
Finally, do we see Ukraine as sabotaging the pipelines if they get into a desperate situation? Do we see that as a possibility here?
I personally don't see it. I think that, first of all, it wouldn't defeat the Russian military. Second, the retaliation against their citizens could be enormous. Third, the long-term damage to the country would be lasting. The environmental damage would be significant. The destruction would cause, there'd be casualties just due to fire and so on. So I don't really, and I don't see that as being consistent also with the way that Ukraine's approaching this. I mean, they've maintained the moral high ground. I don't see that happening personally.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Thanks our panelists. Thank you for our great audience today. Excellent questions. We had a few still some nuclear questions, but I think that we've addressed that on the possibility of use of nuclear weapons in this, which we see as very remote. However, it might pay us to keep in mind the longer of a conflict goes on, the more complications come up, and the rules of chance take over, as well as the chance of other countries being dragged into it. We'd love to be back with you again next month and do this again. I hope our panelists can join us. Thank you very much, panelists, for your great presentations and your attention to our audience. And we hope to see you all again soon.